But tonight, we have the Reunited States of America. Please join me in welcoming author Mark Gerzon.
Good evening. Can you hear me without that or not?
No.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, nice to be with all of you. Great to be with all of you. And she said friends of the library. Do you want to be friends? Are there any enemies of the library here? Identify ourselves first. Because if this is about a divided country, about there'd be enemies as well as friends. But it's good to know we're all friends of the library. That means we have something in common even before we've begun. Well, I'm really delighted to be with you, and look forward to sharing with you some thoughts and hearing your own. But before I begin, I'd just love to have a couple people say, why did you come with all the number of things you could be doing tonight, and all the wonderful shows on TV, and some lovely subjects? Why did you come here? What are you, the question or the concern in your heart that makes you come out tonight? Yes, sir.
Well, I'm very frustrated with the fact that the two political parties cannot find any common ground, especially at the federal level. I think states went better.
So he's frustrated that these two parties don't seem to be able to get along at all. Yes, ma'am.
I'm here because I'm just mad as hell.
She's mad at hell and quote somebody else. I can't take it. Yes, sir.
I'm here because things that really aren't partisan have become partisan.
Right.
And the Rockies have it all.
He has his notebook out ready to take notes. So yes, ma'am.
I'm concerned about the future of our country and what's happening.
Yeah, you're concerned about the future, and that means our children and everything else. Yes, ma'am.
So we see it in a big way on the national level, but I'm concerned because this exists today, even in our community, on our local level, and I don't want it to get like that.
Great. She doesn't want to get like that on the local level. I'm sure you're wondering, how do we prevent it, like infection or a
Well,
disease?
it's already here.
I understand. Yes, in back.
Oh, I'm just always hopeful, so I want to hear positive.
All right. So, yes, sir.
Lack of integrity and honesty.
Concerned about the lack of integrity and honesty, and we'll let you close up.
A friend of mine rode a bicycle from here to North Carolina, and just hearing about his trip through Kansas was mind-blowing. The fact that we have one country, but there are people living completely different lives, like within just one county.
That people are living in different lives in different worlds, even in the same county.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we have to have one more comment. Yes.
I'm here because my neighbor, who I've known for 14 or 15 years, is now collecting guns, and conversations we used to be able to have, we can't, and we've finally given up. We're not talking to each other, and that breaks my heart. And I'm a professional communicator.
She says she's a professional communicator, and she's got a neighbor who's collecting guns, and we can't really talk to each other anymore. It concerns her. Yes.
I just feel like I've lost respect for our leaders, and it's affected me personally, and I'm having problems with that, and that's why I'm here, because I need to rise above that, and I'm having difficulty doing that, because I feel out of control.
She's saying that she's lost respect for our leaders. It's starting to affect her personally, and she wants to rise above that, which is an interesting phrase, but how do you do that? How do you stay above that? How does he not get kind of poisoned by what's around you? So let me tell a few stories for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to go to all of you and see what's on your minds. Is that okay? I want to start by telling you that I was in a room in Vail. This is from the Vail Daily a couple of weeks ago. And there were 100 people in a room in Vail, not like this room, except all of them had. So imagine you had, like they did, a little clicker in your hand so you could vote.
I don't think you're...
This is not on, or I'm not holding it up. All right. So imagine you're in this room in Vail, and you have a little electronic clicker in your hand, and you can vote. So we started the evening by asking these 100 people who came out just like you came out tonight. We started by asking them, are you a Democrat, Republican, or an independent? 33 Republicans out of the 100, 32 Democrats, 30 independents, and 4 other.
Wow.
So I'm standing in front of them going, wow, I've got a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 100 people, citizens of Eagle County, How exciting. Then we asked them, oh, well, before I get to that, let me just say a word about why this is so exciting for me, because you live in Longmont, Colorado, which straddles districts 4 and 2. I currently live in District 2, down the diagonal. And this fall, I'm moving with my wife and my daughter Mariah, who's here, and we're moving a few miles up, and we're going to be in District 4. We're going to be your neighbors in Ken Buck's district. So I'm moving from a blue district to a red district, and guess what? I'm going to be the same guy, but I'm suddenly going to go from being blue to red just simply by moving a couple miles up Route 36. So I wanted you to know that, and I wanted to look at that because it's really a strange thing, because supposedly all those people in that 4 area are red, and all those people in that 2 area are blue. But I know these people. In fact, on the week of the inauguration, Ken Buck and Jared Polis invited me to facilitate a dialogue in Washington. And I facilitated a dialogue that included people who went to the inauguration and women who went to the Women's March, which both my wife and I went to. So we had 30 people in the room who participated in those 2 events. And Ken Buck and Jared Polis were in the room with us. And it was a fascinating evening. And I'm excited to come to this district because Ken and Jared talked about having a meeting here in Longmont because they thought Longmont would be a great place to have a dialogue between the 2 districts. So in case I forget in the Q&A period, I would love it if some of you would make this happen. And I would love it if at least 10, if not 40 of you would write to Ken Buck and say, hey, what happened to that dialogue you're going to have with Jared Polis? We'd love to have a dialogue between districts 4 and 2. The concept was, all across America, there are these red and blue districts that sit side by side. And they don't talk to each other. And the idea was, let's start a little dialogue between 4 and 2. You know, they're right there. In fact, they could meet right here in this room, because this room is where Jared and Ken talked about, right here was the right place for them to meet, because nobody has to drive too far, except I suppose if you live down there and, well, the bottom of 4 is pretty far away. So, anyway, that's a little background before we go to Vail. So, what we did in Vail was we picked 5 issues. And remember, you've got your clicker in your hand. So imagine you got a clicker in your hand and you're being asked, what is your point of view on guns? A, ensure guns are allowed in public places so bad guys know they will meet and return fire from good guys. So the more guns you have out there, the better. Or ban all guns from public places and rely on local response. So how would you vote? Well, in Vail, 40% or whatever voted for one of those, and 45 voted for another one, and 5% checked other. We did that on 5 issues: climate change, immigration, energy, and guns. Then, after I gave a little talk, the same 100 people, clickers in their hands, we gave them these choices. Suddenly they went from a left-right choice to 4 choices. Now look at these 4, and read them and ask yourself, which would you vote for when it comes to the issue of guns in public places, particularly schools? Which would you vote for? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Well, what happened in Vail was that 80% of the people who picked options 1 and 4 shifted to options 2 and 3. On every single issue, energy, immigration, climate change, guns, they shifted from the, let's call it the Obama position and the Trump position, to a more moderate, creative, problem-solving position. And they're all sitting in the room watching this happen live, spontaneously, knowing that their neighbors, who were Democrat, Republican, Independent, were switching with them. So what did we learn from that? We learned that we had visceral proof in the room that day in Vail that Americans are yearning for more than 2 choices, because the 2 choices are polarized, extreme, and twisting the truth, most of them. And that if you give people more choices, they go to it. And smart-ass scholars will say, oh, all these independents, all these people call themselves independents or moderates, they're just people who are left and right, they're just saying they're not, just to be independent. But the fact is, if right now all of you were thirsty and I had Pepsi and Coke, most of you would take a Pepsi or a Coke. But if we had 2 more choices, you might well take the other 2 choices. And we don't even know what the American people would do right now, because so that's the context I'd like, before we dive in and go a little bit further. Same thing with climate change, just illustrate, again, it's a hoax or worse, it's the greatest threat to humanity and government should do something about it. Well, most people pick A or B. But when we gave them A, B, C, and D, 85% migrated from the first two choices to one of those two in the middle. Why? Because we're basically a problem-solving people that want to move ahead. And that's what I'd like to unpack with you tonight. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk with you, not so much about my book, because you're welcome to read my book. It's in the library. It's available on Amazon. But I'll just say enough about this because I really want to address the questions in the room, which were about hope and despair and possibility and frustration. So I grew up in the 50s in Indiana. I grew up in one of the most conservative places at one of the most conservative times. We were a state that elected Nixon and was consistently very, very conservative. And the Ku Klux Klan had a strong hold in our neighborhood and one of the most racist places. And then I went to Harvard. I was the first student in my college to go to Harvard. And suddenly I find myself in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the late 1960s. So I went from one of the most conservative places at one of the most conservative times to one of the most liberal places at one of the most liberal times. And I thought, well, that's basically the choice that you have. And people are supposed to fight, and they fight one each other. That's what they do. You argue left, right, and sure enough, that's what I started doing. Since I was a liberal, I would argue liberal positions. And I found out after arguing for most of my 20s that nobody really changed their mind. And our project that we were part of, where I was working with a young woman named Hillary Rodham Clinton at Yale, we didn't change anybody's mind, and Richard Nixon continued to do exactly what he wanted to do, and nobody really changed. And that's when I said, well, there's got to be something different. And that's when I started studying the data. This is from just a few years ago. And I realized, well, I wasn't the only person who felt there was some other approach that was needed. But the question is, what was that? So I started studying mediation and conflict resolution. And I thought, okay, I don't have to take sides. I'm going to be this guy who mediates between them. And I did that for a while. And after doing it and writing about it, including a book that this young gentleman here has read, that I wrote in 1996 called A House Divided, 6 Belief Systems Struggling for America's Soul. If you want to review, ask, what's your name, sir? Mark Gerzon, asking about the Reunited States, or the divided states of America. I was asked by Congress to design the retreat, so I had this experience of facilitating retreats for more than half the Congress, and that's when I found out that they're not that different from us. That if they weren't trapped in this crazy system where you have to be left or right and where the whip of both parties will whip you, literally, if you get out of line, that a lot of those moderates were feeling like they would say, Mark, I don't have any power. That's what they say to David Skaggs, the guy who used to represent Boulder County, who I worked with on the retreats. He'd say, no, Mark, we have no place to go. The people who actually wanted to solve problems, they had no place to go, so they started this retreat process. And I got all hopeful then, and I thought, oh, great, we've got hope here. Something's going to happen. This was 1996. Well, 20 years later, you kind of know what happened. And that's when I sort of dropped into a deeper place, and I said to myself, there's got to be a deeper transformation, because the last 20 years have proved to me that simply talking about this on the same level and asking people to get along and be more civil, it's not working, And I think it's because there's a deeper shift in each of us that's required. There's a deeper shift that really involves recognizing, and that's what this picture's about. You all walked in here this morning with your left foot and your right foot. That's how you got here. If you walked in here this evening just taking steps, that's how you got here. If you tried to just go on one foot, you get worn out pretty fast. So we were left-right creatures from the beginning. Everything we do is left-right. You're looking at me now, if you're fortunate enough, with a left eye and a right eye, and you're seeing me more clearly. So the whole idea that we're not able to hold left and right, that somebody's persuaded us we can't hold left and right, is crazy. We're all holding it right at this moment. Your left and right hemisphere are processing what I'm saying, and your left and right lung are breathing air. So this is who we are. But once we bring up an issue, then suddenly somehow or other, we've been persuaded, and I would almost say we've been entranced to think that we have to go left or right. Well, let's look at a couple of issues. Slow it down for a minute. Let's look at a couple of issues and see what happens. On the economy, people are left and right on the economy. Well, what does that actually mean? What I've studied and what I write about in the United States of America is that people on the left tend to be suspicious of big business and less suspicious of big government. People on the right tend to be more suspicious of government and less suspicious of big business. Well, I've worked with members of Congress, and we've talked about this. I've literally sat them down in a West Virginia retreat center, and we've talked about this. Because you may remember there was a stimulus bill not long ago And the whole thing about was how do you stimulate the economy? Well, all the Republicans wanted to stimulate the economy by giving a bunch of money to big corporations, so big corporations could hire more people and expand. And all the Democratic congresspeople, they wanted to give the stimulus money to government programs like welfare, unemployment insurance to increase the spending power. And I said to them, you know, before we start to argue about this, could you just briefly summarize what's the data that you have that proves that giving money to big corporations stimulates the economy? And what's the data you have that shows that giving money to unemployment programs and stuff stimulates the economy? What's the evidence? Where does it come from? What country? What year? And these guys and women looked around at each other and kind of, well, you know, we don't really have any data, but, you know, we said, well, why don't you form a committee and actually study what would stimulate the economy? A bipartisan committee to study what would stimulate the economy before you throw a lot of millions of dollars at it. So they go, wow, it's a good idea, let's do that. So they formed this committee at our little retreat center in West Virginia, and then they went back to Capitol Hill, and I called a week later. And I said, how's the committee going? They said, oh, party leaders said we couldn't do it. Yeah, we got an election coming up, and the whole point is to milk this issue to get an advantage for the next election. So I said, so you're not even going to try to find out what stimulates the economy? I said, well, no, we can't do it. So that was a lesson to me, okay, there's a real fundamental issue here. They tell us, the people, they're going to stimulate the economy, but they don't know how. Yet they're going to argue about it as if they do know how. So take another issue, internet privacy. What do you think the founding fathers, what do you think Jefferson would have said about internet privacy? What does the Constitution say about internet privacy? What are the amendments to the Constitution say about internet privacy? Well, they don't say a lot, yeah, because this gentleman's going like this. There was no internet in 1776, you know. So Jefferson assumed that we were going to learn something. He assumed that citizens were going to learn something because they never presumed that they would have solved the problem of internet privacy back in 1776. So to me, this issue illustrates, I know there's a left position on this, and I know there's a right position, but even our congressmen and senators are confused. Rand Paul, one of the most conservative senators, went to Berkeley to give a talk at the Berkeley Law School defending internet privacy and arguing against government intrusion into the internet. There's the most conservative senator going to Berkeley Law School because he was basically saying there's nothing conservative or liberal about this. It's do we want our internet communication to be private or not? And he was arguing, yes, we do. He was arguing that's not conservative, that's not liberal, that's just wanting privacy when we write a letter. So again, another issue beyond left and right. Then this issue of guns. You know, I've had, on radio shows, I've had folks come on the radio who are pro-gun, and I've had people come on anti-gun. And I've been asked, in fact, there was one New York program where I was given 20 minutes to facilitate a dialogue between pro-gun and anti-gun people and have them come to some positive resolution. I said to the host, thanks so much for your confidence in me as a mediator, but I'm not sure I can do that in 20 minutes on the radio here. I did the best I could. And I said to this pro-gun person, who was basically saying, you know, go back to those two positions. Yes, if we had guns in schools, and there were a lot of guns in schools, and everybody had guns in schools, our kids would be a lot safer. And he was arguing against a woman who said, you know, we shouldn't have guns anywhere. Look at those Swedish countries. You know, they don't have a lot of gun violence there. They don't have a lot of guns, and it's much better if there are no guns anywhere. And I said to them, well, thank you both for being on the show with us. Imagine you have kids going to the same school. Imagine they go to this neighborhood school right here in Longmont. What would you do to make them safer tomorrow when they go to school? Are you two willing to actually sit down and make the school safer? Or are the two of you just going to keep arguing your pro-gun and anti-gun position? And I made it really clear. And the sad truth was, in those 20 minutes, basically they proved that all they wanted to do was argue their pro-gun and anti-gun position. I said, well, thank you very much for participating, but guess what? Your kids are going to be in just as much danger tomorrow as they were today, because you're not going to make that school any safer. So to me, it's an issue that when you look into it, communities like Longmont or any other community, they have to sit down and say, how are we going to make our schools safer? And it's not the pro-gun or anti-gun position. It's not guns everywhere, and it's not guns nowhere. It actually takes neighbors sitting down, really loving and caring about their kids and their teachers and their schools, and coming up with plans that they think works for their school communities. We can talk more about that. And the bottom line in all these is what the first chapter of the book is about. Every single issue requires the same thing. It requires that we as citizens learn. So it means that if you were all coming here to a city council meeting, the typical way somebody comes to a city council meeting is they come thinking, I'm gonna tell those sons of bitches what I think. Well, that's fine, you know, it's democracy. But you could also say, I'm gonna come to the city council to learn what's best for my community, and I'm gonna bring my point of view, and I'm gonna listen to other points of view, and I'm gonna try to figure out what really is best for my community, because maybe I don't have the answer. Well, that's learning. And to me, that's an attitude that we've kind of lost. So for me, when the very first chapter of the book is called Learning, because to me, that's the key. If you're not willing to learn, then you're basically stuck with whatever your priest or your parent or your teacher told you 20, 30, 40 years ago, and in some of our cases 50, 60 years ago. And that's not what democracy needs, because the world keeps changing. Democracy keeps changing. And so if you're going to trot out the same attitude or position you had 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that's not going to keep up with the times. And even if you're 15, you should be a learner, because these are difficult, tough issues. And these left-right positions simply don't do it. So the reason I wrote the Reunited States of America was I wanted people to have the experience of actually hearing about 40, 50, 60, 70 groups that are out there that are crossing the divide every day. Our alternatives are not join the Democratic Party or join the Republican Party and vote once on November and then go home and complain. We have other options. And I encourage you to go to my book or to a number of other websites, including bridgealliance.us. Bridgealliance.us is a network of 72 organizations, all of whom are crossing the divide. And you can pick one that you like, and we have some here. Right here in the room, talk to, your name again was? Talk to Jalaire, who's a Longmont citizen and who's part of an organization called Mormon Women for Ethical Government. There's another organization right here that makes it 73. The fact is there are hundreds of organizations and people crossing the divide, but we aren't paying any attention to them because there's no oxygen left in the room. After we finish talking about Donald Trump's tweets and Hillary Clinton's emails, there's no oxygen left in the room. And so we as citizens have to start remembering what we meant when we said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. It meant the flag. It didn't say, I'm not saying I pledge allegiance to the red stripes or the white stripes. I'm pledging allegiance to my star, but not your star. We were pledging allegiance to this thing, which as a kid I didn't understand. I thought it was just a stupid piece of cloth. But it's actually a symbol of a union that's bigger than any of us. It's pledging allegiance to a greater awareness, a holistic awareness. It's pledging allegiance to kind of humility and learning and all those things that the Founding Fathers wanted. So I'm going to pause there and just see what's going on in the room and see where you all want to go, because what really interests me is what communities like Longmont can do that's exciting, that's powerful, that sends a message to the state and to the country that there's something new happening. So let's do a popcorn of comments and questions, starting with this gentleman here. Yes, sir.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the state of media, because I agree with everything you say, but if, as most people watch cable news, though they shouldn't, in my opinion, with most people watching cable news, how they're only going to believe whichever news media whether it's left, right, it doesn't matter. Whatever that media says tends to be truth, and I don't think the media is ever going to direct them towards solutions that you're presenting. How could that be overcome?
Well, let me put in a plug for one of those 72 organizations. It's called allsides.com. And if you go to allsides.com, you will get the news from the left, the right, and the center every day. My friend John Gable, who used to work in Silicon Valley and helped develop the internet that we all use, realized that this internet, which is supposed to bring us all together, is in fact creating what he calls bias bubbles. And so, as kind of a recovering Silicon Valley executive, he started allsides.com. And allsides.com is being used in schools, and it's accessible to any one of us. So anybody who wants to, and who says, you know, I'd actually like to do what my kids are doing at school, which is to learn from see things from different points. You go to allsides.com, one website, and systematically get the news from three perspectives. Now, that's not a magic panacea to the problem. I'm not suggesting that will solve it, because again, you would probably be sitting there saying, well, Mark, how will most people even know allsides.com exists? And that's the challenge that I think that we face, which is there are solutions out there. There are these exciting things out there, but how do we find out about them in this fog that we're being given? And it's the fog of those two alternatives. We're being given those two alternatives, invited to make Fox News or MSNBC our home. And we all have our preferences, but the phrase that I use is, let's not become prisoners of our preferences. Let's not become prisoners of our preferences. If we took a poll of this room, you'd have neighbors here who differ with you fundamentally on different issues. And allsides.com is a place to kind of do that on the web. The other thing is that there's absolutely nothing stopping you or anybody else from starting another talk show, another network. I remember when Ted Turner started, I'm old enough to remember when Ted Turner started CNN. And people thought, oh, it's going to fail. That's totally going to fail. And Ted Turner was enough of an obstinate, narcissistic multimillionaire to make it work. But any of us could do that right now, and I'm hoping that we do. And I'm working personally on a talk show. I'd love to see a talk show that gets great ratings where people actually listen to each other. The show's called Listen Up. And if I can find the right network and the right partner, we'll create a show called Listen Up, and people who want to can actually go to a show where people are actually talking about these issues and learning from each other and saying, gee, I didn't realize that. But let me ask you a question. And digging a little, like kick fracking, digging a little deeper where people are actually learning something. I haven't seen anybody learn anything on a show on television, news show on television, and as long as I can remember. Nobody ever learns anything. They already know the answer before the program starts. Other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
When you have a constituency that votes a certain way, they're looking for answers, and you have elected representatives, whether they be city council, state legislature, or the Congress, and they do not respond to what the citizens are asking for.
What do you do? Well, this gets you to the. Did anybody hear his question? No. He said when you have elected representatives who don't actually listen to and respond to what their constituents want, what do? Well, the conventional answer to that is you run somebody against them and you beat them. I mean, that's the old answer. You run somebody against them and you beat them. The problem is that, going back to this scenario we were talking about, you usually have to go way to the other side to find that person, and then suddenly you've gone from the fire into the, from the frying pan into the fire. So I actually think you need to probably run somebody against them, but you need to run somebody against them in a different way. And here I'll put in a plug for another project. The Centrist Project, put in centristproject.org, has just adopted Colorado as one of 2 states in the United States of America that they want to become a showcase for how to elect independents to office. And they've moved from San Francisco and Washington to Denver, and their offices are now in Denver, and they are going to showcase Colorado and Maine as 2 states that from top to bottom, from your city council all the way to governor, can Colorado elect independent? And they're doing that not because for precisely the reasons that we're talking about, which is let's have some candidates who say, I've got some liberal opinions, I've got some conservative opinions, but I walk with 2 feet, and I'm going to actually try to get us somewhere. And they would be much more likely to listen, and they need us to get elected, obviously, because there's a Democratic and a Republican machine, stronger or weaker depending on where you are in Colorado. But they're going to have to rely on people like us, and they're mostly young, they're mostly millennials, and they're mostly planning to use the internet and other systems for getting elected and other ways of raising money besides the usual ways. So go to centristproject.org, and they could use your help. And Longmont is exactly the kind of city that could become a showcase in Colorado for what's possible. Yes, sir.
What I don't understand is how and why we've lost the ability to judge an issue based on its merits as opposed to looking at it from the framework of our own dogma. And how do we change that back?
You're asking that on an individual level, like us as citizens, or you're asking it like people in Washington or sitting in Congress?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure we as people have actually lost it. I don't think the average American is less intelligent, less caring, less thoughtful, less rational than they were 20 years ago. If that's true, we're in real trouble. I think we only know how we behave in public. And this is one of the great tragedies, that when I saw these members of Congress behave in private, I really respected these people. and I really liked these people. And I thought they were really fine men and women. And then I see them behave in public, and it was recently reported in the press that when Democrat and Republican in Congress now start to like each other and become friends, they kind of say, we better keep this private. We better keep this private. Because they know that the consequences of showing it publicly, and this is the real tragedy, that we don't really know how rational or thoughtful the American people are. And the reason I started with the Vail story is because the Vail story was my first-hand experience of a group of 100 people focus group voluntarily clicking their clickers and going from extreme left and right to moderate problem-solving positions. That doesn't mean they all agreed. But the other thing about those middle positions, people who take those middle positions can have a conversation. They can have a debate. They can have a dialogue. You can sit down and actually talk things through. From positions 1 and 4, from climate change is a hoax to climate change is the greatest threat to the human race, there's no conversation. There's no place to start. You know, where are you going to start? So that's not a small difference. It means that people can start to, use your phrase, sir, judge things on the merits. So I think the people can do that. I just don't think we have a system that can do that. And the story I told about the members of Congress and the stimulus bill, that's what I saw in Congress. They know how to think through the stimulus question. They know how to form a fact-finding committee to look at what would stimulate the economy. They're just not permitted to do it by the political system because they're trying to get the edge on the other team. And I use the word team. I just want to say a word about sports because I'll often use a lot of sports metaphors. And the fact is, we have more sophisticated rules for basketball, the NBA championships, the Super Bowl. I mean, I never cease to amaze me the amount of passion around sports. And then after the game is over, I don't hear a lot of people saying that wasn't fair. I don't see a lot of people saying the vote was rigged. I don't see a lot of people saying the score wasn't correct. I mean, that's how the game turned out. We complain about a call maybe here or there on an NBA game or something, but basically, but we don't agree on the rules, and we don't have officiating, and we don't, all those structures we've created for sports have started to break down in our system. If you look at, read in my book what I say about the Federal Election Commission, for example. The Federal Election Commission is the commission that's supposed to guarantee that our elections are fair and safe. Look at what's happened to that institution. Basically, it's been turned into a game where you have to get 4 votes to do anything, and there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans appointed by the party leaders in the Congress. So with 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and you've got to get 4 votes to do something, I mean, you know, give me a break. Nothing's going to happen, and that's what's happening. We have this total chaos. So we need to start caring as much about if all of us cared as much about our politics as we cared about the NCAA finals and as we cared about who won the Super Bowl, and you mentioned something about who was off tonight, who wasn't playing? The Rockies, yeah. We cared as much about civic affairs as we did about that. But that'd be a major shift in consciousness. Yes, ma'am.
What you're saying is how I think a lot of us feel. It makes perfect sense. However, what we're against is big money and the lobbyists. And how do you abut that? I mean, they're self-serving and they can buy their power. And we don't have that kind of money. So how can we logically do what you're talking about when that's what we're against?
Well, and I happen to agree that you've asked a very important question.
Yeah.
And I'll say a word about my last year to tell you why I believe you've asked the most important question. Last year we were poised, some colleagues of mine and I were poised to get a city in America to stand up alongside Philadelphia and Cleveland. We were poised to get a city to stand up and say, well, they celebrate the Republicans in Cleveland, they celebrate the Democrats in Philadelphia. We here in Kansas City, or we here in Denver, we're going to celebrate all the people who crossed the divide. And we were poised to get a city to do that. And you know what stopped us? $250,000. We could have raised $250,000 for the city that we were working with. Well, remain nameless for a moment. We could have gotten that city to host it, and we probably could have raised millions of dollars in that city, because that city had come up with $60 million in their bid to host the Republican convention. And they hadn't gotten the Republican convention. So if they could raise $60 million for the Republican convention, we argued to them, you can certainly raise $4 or $5 or $6 million to host this convention. Well, we could have done it if we'd raised $250,000. So that experience of $250,000 stopping us, that, by the way, that was the kind of money that Clinton or Trump, they raised like that.
Per plate.
Per plate, yes. Well put, so you're my fundraiser now. Okay. But my point is, your name, ma'am, is? Elaine. Elaine's point is, so I concluded what you concluded, which is, I'm not going to keep doing this work if I can't solve the money problem. So several months ago, I started organizing a meeting, which is now happening in November, and I'm trying to figure out how to talk about it so that I'm not violating confidence. I think I'll just keep it vague. There's a meeting happening in November on the East Coast to which the representatives of the Soros family are invited and coming. Representatives of the Koch family are invited and coming. And 20 other funders are coming who are on the left and right and who all are appalled at what's happening with their money and what's happening to the country. And we're going to sit them down for 2.5 days at a very prestigious estate of a very wealthy family that will remain nameless. And they're going to sit down and we're going to say to them, how do you feel about how your money's working? How do you feel about the way your millions are being spent? And I guarantee you, the Kochs are not very happy with Donald Trump, and the folks on the left are not very happy with what's happening on the progressive side. And they're going to basically start looking at each other and saying, is there some other way we can use our funds? My hope is that after that meeting, in the middle of November, I could come back here to the library and say, even the people that we're talking about, that we're saying are the problem, even they are starting to say we've got to do something about it. Because I agree with you that until those people with the millions and billions, until they start thinking a little differently, and they literally felt that they could use their money to get their way, what they're finding out is that their money's not getting their way. They're not getting what they want. And that's the key as a mediator. That's what I learned in South Africa when people say, why did South Africa turn around? Because they realized they couldn't get what they wanted through war and violence. They had to actually sit down together. They had to let Mandela out of prison. And did it solve all problems? No, but it began a dialogue. So I want you to know we're working on that. And anybody who wants to help, we can use your help. Because, guess what? Our project's underfunded. Yes, Elaine.
One thing that I see as a major problem, and I don't know how it's solvable, are some of the rules. Like Congress who gets to decide what their paycheck is and their benefits are that continue on after they're no longer serving.
Right.
And that they get better benefits than the rest of us do as far as their health care and the gerrymandering as far as our system. Those are all crooked things. But how can we change that? Because they're the ones that decide the rules.
And how to get
And that's
term limits
wrong.
on them when they're the ones that have to vote for it.
Yeah, I don't have answers to all these questions, except I can guarantee that if you look at the 72 organizations, there's some that are working on that. And the ones that are working on gerrymandering are really exciting. The ones that are working on money are exciting. The ones that are working on term limits are exciting. But unless you approach it from across the divide, and in the past people have said, liberals, let's say, have said, oh, we're going to stop that from happening. And then, of course, the liberals create their own opposition. Conservatives say, well, we're going to change that. And you're seeing what's happening with healthcare now. I mean, it's just a big mess. It's a big mess because you cannot ram things through and have them last. You can have a short-term victory. Obamacare was a short-term victory pushed through by Democrats. But it's not going to last because it has to become a bipartisan consensus. That might happen if we're lucky. If we're lucky, if we see some real statesmanship in Congress, it still might happen. They do. Some other comments? Yes, ma'am.
So, at
You
the
have been-
national level, that's all really big and we're really small, so.
So let's go to
I want
Longmont.
to take it down, I want to take it down to Longmont. So, you're right, Longmont is on the border of 4 and 2, but it's also in a county that's dominated by a single party. It happens to be my party, but it's a party that I feel very alienated. I feel they've left me behind. And they've gone down this other path, and so now I'm a lonely Democrat that doesn't belong anymore with my party. So what can we do at a local level to bring our party back? That pendulum has swung so far, and not all of us want to get on the ride.
So what's your own political ambition?
My political ambition, I've been a Democrat since I was able to vote, and it's the party of my grandparents. And in my mind, it has a vision of being the party for everybody. That's what I grew up with. I grew up with the concept of a melting pot and the party that welcomed everybody and had a voice and an ear for everybody. And I don't feel that's my party today. And how do we change that conversation and pull it back?
Tell me what your name is, your first and last name.
Camille Countess.
What's your last name?
A countess.
A countess. Is that Hispanic?
It's actually
Greek.
French.
French. Well, and your first name is Camille?
Camille.
So why don't you run for office?
Actually, my husband did.
Oh, what did he run for?
He ran for city council.
Uh-huh.
And he lost. I'm a Democrat. He's a Republican.
Perfect.
But it was hilarious because we would go knocking on doors and here's my husband and here's his moderate views and we love Longmont, we raise our kids here. And I had doors slammed in my face as soon as I'd open the door, I'd begin my spiel, and their first question was, what is his political party? And as soon as I said, he's a Republican, but boom, the door shut.
My advice is for you and your husband to call the Centrist Project and tell them that you or your husband, my preference is you, but if you want to bow to your husband, go ahead, that you're running for office. And you want to talk with the Centrist Party about running as an independent.
Okay.
Because the next time you open a door, they say, what's your party? You say, we're independents, and here's why. And suddenly they go, really? And suddenly they're not slamming the door in your face for that reason. They'll have to find another reason to slam the door in your face. So I do think on a local level, there's some real possibilities. Plus, there's a lot of ways that you can start creating cross-boundary dialogues here, and I can't think of a better pair to do that than you and your husband. Because you're married, you live under the same roof. You know, whether you have children or not or whatever, you know, you've demonstrated that a Democrat and Republican know how to get along. How long have you been married?
32 years.
So most of the principles of dialogue across the partisan divide basically mirror what couples counseling is about. All of the same principles, you know. Do you have safety? Do you have ground rules? Are you listening? All those things that we all know are what life is all about. They apply to politics as well. And I really can't think of a better pair than the two of you. So I don't see why we don't start right there. And, you know, you've got 100 other voters here. So,
Please don't slam your door.
so remember Camille, a countess?
A countess.
A countess. Camille, a countess, and her husband's name is?
Rick.
Rick. All right. So we've got some new candidates coming up. Is your hand up or are you just stretching?
It's up.
Okay, go for it.
I don't think this is a new problem. I mean, I think that the parties have always been divided. We've always been so nasty to each other. I mean, if you study history at all, I mean, would you agree that, is this out of the ordinary? Has it gotten worse, or has it just always been this way?
Let's take your premise for a moment that it's true, that it's always been this way. What's your point? Or is that really the question?
I guess it's time to change it, right? But I just don't.
Well,
I don't think we can look back to some golden age where we all got along.
No, but let me say that whether it's gotten worse or whether it's always been this bad, how does that change what the challenge is ahead of us? My personal opinion is, having worked in this field for 25 years, it's gotten worse. I can tell you personally why I believe that. Because 25 years ago, 1996, 1992, there was a whole group of members of Congress who moved forward to do these bipartisan retreats. And if I told you the story, which I could, it took a few minutes, of what happened in 1996 and 1998, it was remarkable. Because there was a center in Congress of 40, 60, 80 members of Congress of both parties who said, this isn't working, we've got to fix this. And they hired people like me, and they raised all this money, and we took 220 members of the House of Representatives off for a weekend. It was the largest movement of members of Congress in peacetime history. We took them off for a weekend to work on their relationship. It was like a couples retreat for Congress, right? And can you imagine that happening today? You know, so it's gotten worse. Believe me, it's gotten worse. The quality of discourse has gotten worse, and the amount of money that needs to be raised has gotten worse, and the quality of the ads and the toxicity of the ads has gotten worse. But even if it hadn't, even if you could go back and say, oh, it's always been this bad, the challenge is still the same, which is that we have fundamental problems as a culture, including the 5 that we talked about in Vail, guns and immigration and climate change, etc. it got to be solved or things are going to get worse. And this woman in this beautiful purple dress said something about the future. She cares about the future. And that's what happened when Ken Buck and Jared Polis sat together with a group of mostly women. Ken Buck, I don't think he'll mind my repeating this, Ken Buck, we went around the circle and said, he asked the question of the circle, what are you most worried about for your kid's future? I was really struck that Ken asked that question. And this mostly liberal group of women, because this was the day of the march, so it was tended to be more liberal than conservative, these women started saying, well, climate change, or the right to control my own body, or immigration and keeping families together, whatever they said. And then Ken Buck said, thank you, and I turned to Ken and I said, well, and what about you? What do you think is the biggest threat to the future for our children? And he said the national debt. He said the national debt, because if we don't solve that, all these issues that all these lovely people have just mentioned aren't going to get solved. And then suddenly a really good conversation unfolded, because when he made the argument that you had to deal with the national debt to deal with some of those other issues, suddenly everybody was listening to Ken. And Ken wasn't this Republican from District 4 anymore. He was a guy who was actually thinking about the future and had a different perspective. And I really respected what happened in the room, and it was the beginning of the dialogue that I wanted to see happen across Districts 2 and 4. So, Camille, one of the things you can do with your husband is start that across the boundary conversation. You're a Republican and Democrat. Start that cross-boundary conversation, and then call up Buck and Polis and say, hey, your guys and your staff dropped the ball. We're picking it up, and we, the citizens of Longmont, and let's say Boulder if you want to cross the divide, we are starting that dialogue. And I can't think of a better way to run for office either, because suddenly people say, well, what have you done deserves for you to run for whatever the office you run for? Well, we've created a cross, da-da-da. So I just think there's opportunities, but it requires shifting from a complaining, woe is us, yuck kind of feeling, to a what can I do, and I'm going to make my life more meaningful. I'm going to make my life more meaningful by doing something. When my wife and I went to Africa, and we were around a lot of victims of genocide, we experienced some people who experienced horrible traumatic experiences in genocide, who were devastated by it and never recovered. And then we worked with other young people, refugees, some of whom are coming to Boulder for a meeting this summer, who are the most remarkable, resilient, creative people, and they all experienced traumatic experiences. And when we looked at what made one person resilient and creative out of a trauma and what made one person devastated and overwhelmed, was whether they had a sense of agency. Was there something they could do to make things better? If there was nothing they could do to make things better, they were like that rat in a cage, they can't control them when they get shocked. It's just a helpless feeling of not being able to do anything. But when you have a sense of agency, so my feeling is what we as citizens need is a sense of agency, that we're doing something that feels like, this might make a difference. Going back to hope. Who mentioned hope at the beginning? Somebody, yes. That, to me, what gives me hope is when I'm doing something that I think might make a difference. So I wrote the book in part to surround myself with these 40 groups that gave me hope. And it was a very selfish, narcissistic thing to do. I want to be surrounded by people who are doing good work. I don't want to be surrounded by Clinton and Trump and all that bullshit. And I know that I've just been recorded, and I apologize. Yes, sir.
Oh, were you finished?
I was. Bullshit was the last thing I was going to say.
That's the first thing I was supposed to. We've talked a little bit about have things changed and so on, and I think one thing that, and by the way, I've read your book, most of it. I was on the last pages this evening trying to get it, but in anticipation of this meeting, thank you, it's a wonderful book. We are the product of not only our upbringing. We're the product of not only our upbringing, but our culture and our history. And the Western culture, the Western history is dualistic, and by that I think what especially since I think the Enlightenment and so on, we've tended to lean. We see everything as good, bad, right, wrong, Republican, Democrat, all, none, conservative, liberal, and so on. So part, I think, of the problem may be, and it's not mentioned in your book unless I missed it somehow, trying to speed read, but that because we are of the Western culture, and because we are steeped in the dualistic kinds of thing, it's all or none, And we boil things down to those two deadly, completely converse options so often. But it's not because we're not smart necessarily. It's not because we choose that. I think we've been trained that way over many generations. So, nor did you mention in the book, not that you should have, but that the Eastern philosophy, mindset, culture tends to be inclusive. Rather, they don't understand this dualistic approach. They don't see a division between two stark differences. They see more wholeness. So my question to you is, in part, and by the way, I think that as we've evolved as a culture, certainly in this country, I think partly because of this dualistic inculcation, it has now evolved to the point of becoming so incredibly entrenched and codified and pervasive that we find ourselves in this situation that you so eloquently have portrayed. Now, so my question is, just as in psychology, most of this is subliminal, by the way. We don't see this, we don't understand it, we can't perceive it in ourselves. So how can we deal with it, and even when we desire to reach across and to be trans-partisan and so on? So should we study Eastern philosophy? Should we expose ourselves more so that...
What you do professionally other than come to the library?
I'll let my daughter.
What does your dad do?
He's a guitar picker.
He's a guitar picker? So, this gentleman, I gave him the microphone because I had a sense he was going to ask a question that was, did you hear him okay?
Well, I did. Can I answer?
Yes, what do you want to say?
Well, if you're talking about Western culture, if you look at the rest of the Western or like England, Canada, Australia, they all have multiple choices in their election, especially at the high level. And so I'm curious as to why we're the only ones that aren't. Why aren't we studying that? Why are we not electing those people when they get up to a higher level? But I'm a little frustrated.
So the two of you...
Independent over here, so
Well, I can see from where you're sitting that you're and I think the two of you ought to be in a small group discussion group.
I'm actually independent as well.
Great, well, many of you are in your hearts. So let me address this question because it's a beautiful closing question. And I'm seeing my friend Barry Erdman in the back who runs a group in Boulder that's really, what's the name of it?
Interface.
Interface. And I think you should start an interface, talk to Barry and start an interface in Longmont, because interface is basically asking this consciousness question that you're asking. Because you're basically ending the evening by saying, thanks, Mark, this has been a great talk, but isn't there actually a more fundamental consciousness shift that needs to happen? And when I was doing this thing with my feet and eyes and ears, that was my more popular, embodied way of addressing your issue. Because we are whole. And that was my way of saying it without getting all, I have friends who go to retreats for non-dual meditation. There's a non-dual movement, that's all about thinking in a non-dualistic way. And you're right, it does come out of the East. But I'm going to give you a little different twist, because I've been to China. I've worked in China. My books have been translated into Chinese. I'm not going to idealize the Orient. Because the fact is, right now, China is a one-party system that is trying to, yes, it's holistic, but it's holistic in a way that I think is taking a step backwards. So here's my basic philosophy as it applies to consciousness and politics. That primal tribal attitude, we're all one. That's where you all say we have one king or one party and it controls everything. And Western civilization goes back to the French Revolution when they said, no, we don't want a king anymore. And the people who didn't want the king sat on the left. And the people who wanted the king sat on the right. And there was a little aisle in between them. And from that point on, people said, oh, either you're for the king or you're against the king. And there was for and against. And the whole question of could you be for and against, that was the beginning of democracy, which the American Revolution then codified. And we now can say, I hate Trump. I will say that. I hate Trump. I don't go to jail. Nobody shoots me. I go home and I have a nice meal and I go to bed. Because we live in a democracy. That's a step forward. You can't do that in China. So that's going from 1 to 2. Now, my argument is we need to go from 1 to 2 to 3 and 4, that we're stuck in 2. So you're right. We are trapped in a dualistic mind frame. We as a culture tend to be trapped in exactly what you said. But I believe that most people in this room are already out of that mindset. But we don't have a way of expressing it politically, which goes to this, what's your name? Lenny, this goes to Lenny's point, which is that other democracies in the West, who are just as West as we are, have 3 or 4 parties. Doesn't mean they don't think dualistically behind that. That's a major shift in consciousness, and I believe that we're all making it every day. I think anybody who has a family with more than 2 members, where you've got to make more than 2 people get along, I mean, we're already beyond dualism. But what happens is when we start to go from the personal up to the social, up to the political, we tend to regress. And that's become the big challenge of democracy. Nobody knows how, including the United States of America, to create a democracy where 350 million people participate. When we started democracy, I call it, in one of my writings, I called it Democracy 1.0. A bunch of white guys who owned land with high levels of education who came from Europe did a damn good job of creating this country. But it was Democracy 1.0. Women weren't involved, other ethnic minorities weren't involved, people who didn't own land weren't involved, people who lived in the wrong places or had, a lot of people weren't involved. We do not know how to create a country where everybody's involved. That's one of the great sort of steps forward we have to make. And to make that step, we're going to have to make the step that you're challenging us to do. And I agree with you. It is on a very deep level of consciousness. Which is, for me, people say, well, when did you get interested in politics? I say, I'm not really that interested in politics. I'm interested in a better world. And what frustrates me is that so many people, particularly New Age consciousness type people, think that you can create a better world by just praying for it. And I think prayer is wonderful and super important. I think meditation is wonderful if you enjoy it, and all these other things that raise your consciousness. But then you have to do something with it. You have to express it in some form. And that's what's frustrating now, is that there's a whole set of people who are not participating in the system. And millennials, I'll close with this thought and then pass it back to Barbara, wherever Barbara is. Millennials, the data about independence, more than almost 60% of millennials say we're not interested in Democrats or Republicans. I had one person come up to me on the CU campus and say, Mr. Gerzon, yeah, thanks for your talk, but can you explain to me, what is this Democrat-Republican thing that all of you seem to care so much about? And she really kind of like, could you translate this for me? And as a friend of mine said, that's a generation that could buy the song, they didn't have to buy the album. So the whole idea that you're supposed to buy into this left-right thing and sign away your freedom of thought and to become a liberal or a conservative, like, why should I? I like, if I want an Apple product, I'll buy an Apple product. If I want an Android, I'll get an Android. Leave me alone, let me buy what I want, So that's a shift, and it's not quite getting to your more lofty consciousness, but it's the beginning of going beyond this dualistic frame. So,
by the way, just to put a finer point, I was thinking Zen Buddhism, not so much
China.
universal.
Yes, I understand. I was thinking of the yin yang symbol, which has that, the white dot in the black part, the black dot in the white part, and that is which is basically what I'm saying about left-right. So I'm at gerzonam@gmail.com. Anybody who wants to follow up with me because you're passionate about doing something, you'll have a follow-up question. gerzonam@gmail.com. Yes, sir. You have the benediction. You have the benediction.
And that is, most of the congressmen and senators go home on Thursday, and then they come back on Monday. And if they, I don't know how you do it, but if they were required to get to know some people on the other side socially, on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we might get somewhere, because oftentimes when we find out there's 2 of them across the aisle that are friends, sometimes they do something.
Well, it used to be that way because they didn't have airlines that flew quite so often to so many places. But you've got 2 challenges, and maybe you can solve them. The first challenge is you get reelected by going back to your district and serving your constituents. So that's a challenge. And the second is, what are they going to do on the weekend? Who's going to force them to do that? So if I had a lot of money, what I'd probably do is I'd throw a really good party 3 or 4 weekends a year, and I'd invite all of them and their families to come to this absolutely cool place. Because one of my friends said, if you want a revolution, throw a better party. And just throw this great party and say, you and your kids are invited, come to the such and such place for the weekend free. Only catch is, you're gonna be rooming with a member of the other party. And, so you get a rich millionaire to do that. I'll come back to you afterwards. Thank you all, it's been a real pleasure.